The professor's voice cracked through the lecture hall like a whip, and I flinched before I even understood why. Deathworlds, said Professor Vantis Kaur, do not exist. They never existed. They are a story we tell hatchlings to make them behave. Sit still, little one, or the Deathworlders will come for you. A ripple of laughter moved through the rows of seats around me. I did not laugh. My claws were pressed flat against my knees, and my throat had gone dry, because I had spent 3 nights reading about Deathworld theory for this exact class, and I still did not understand why the subject made my chest feel tight. The lecture hall of Corvenna Academy was built in tiers, like a bowl, so that every student could see the professor, and the professor could see every student. Above us, the transparent dome showed the slow wheel of stars, calm and endless, completely unaware that anything important was happening below. I remember thinking how strange it was that the universe could look so peaceful while my nerves were lit up like a warning beacon. Consider the numbers, Professor Kaur continued, pacing along the front platform. His long gray robes swept behind him with each turn. A world with crushing gravity, toxic air, predators at every level of the food chain, including apex predators that hunt in packs, weather violent enough to flatten cities, disease that evolves faster than immune systems can adapt, and somehow, a species is supposed to have crawled out of that world, not just alive, but sane, capable of language, capable of joining a galactic community. He stopped walking and looked out at us, his 4 eyes gleaming under the lights. Tell me, class, does that sound like biology to you, or does it sound like a campfire tale? Several students murmured agreement. Someone near the front actually clapped, twice, like the professor had just won an argument nobody else was having. I sat in the 3rd row from the top, between Leora, a Kithrani girl with pale blue scales who took notes faster than anyone I had ever met, and Denna, who mostly spent lectures trying not to fall asleep. My own species, the Osandi, are not built for confrontation. We are broad-shouldered but slow to anger, careful, methodical. We like rules. We like knowing what is going to happen next. That is probably why Deathworld theory bothered me so much. It was the opposite of a rule. It was a variable nobody could explain. Sir, said a Kethrani boy near the front, raising a clawed hand, but the old survey logs, the abandoned outposts near the edge of unclaimed space, some of them mention encounters with a species that matched Deathworld markers. Extreme strength, extreme durability, aggressive problem-solving. Professor Kaur waved a hand dismissively, the gesture sweeping through the air like he was brushing away smoke. Corrupted data, exaggeration. Fear does strange things to written reports. I have read those same logs, and I can tell you, with confidence, that no such species has ever been verified by a proper scientific body. It is folklore, nothing more. I glanced over my shoulder, toward the back row, where the one human student in our year always sat. Her name was Grace Whitmore. She had been assigned to our cohort at the start of the term, one of only a handful of humans studying anywhere in this sector of the academy system, and in 3 months I had heard her say maybe 40 words total. She kept her head down. She took notes in small, careful handwriting. She ate lunch alone, or sometimes with a Threnai exchange student named Oscar who did not seem to mind the silence. Nobody teased her, exactly, but nobody paid her much attention either. She was simply there, quiet, unremarkable, the way a lamp is unremarkable, until the day the power goes out and you realize how much you needed it. Today she sat exactly where she always sat, 3rd row from the bottom, hands folded on the desk in front of her. Her expression had not changed once during the entire lecture, not when the professor mocked Deathworld theory, not when the class laughed. She simply watched him, calm as still water, her pale eyes tracking his every movement like she was reading a book she had already read before. I turned back around before she noticed me staring. Now, Professor Kaur said, clasping his hands behind his back, let us discuss why the theory persists, despite having no real evidence behind it. Fear is a powerful narrative engine. Species with dangerous but explainable environments, high radiation zones, low oxygen colonies, that sort of thing, have throughout history been mythologized into something far more frightening than they actually were. The Deathworlder legend is simply that process taken to its extreme, a boogeyman built from statistical impossibility. He paused for effect, letting the silence stretch just long enough to feel dramatic. Because ask yourselves this, he said, and his voice dropped lower, almost gentle, almost kind, which somehow made it worse. If such a species existed, if a world really could produce something that strong, that resilient, that violent by necessity of survival, would any of us here, in this room, even be capable of standing in the same environment they evolved in? Would any of us survive a single day on a true death world? Nobody answered right away. The question hung there, heavy, half a joke and half something else. I felt my own pulse in my throat. I thought about the readings I had done the night before, about atmospheric pressure differentials and predator density estimates, and something called a full-grown wolf, a word I had looked up 3 times and still did not fully understand. I thought about how easily Professor Kaur said the word survive, like it was a small thing, like it did not carry any real weight at all. The professor smiled, clearly pleased with himself, ready to move on to the next slide of his presentation, already turning toward the console at the front of the hall. And then, from the back row, a hand went up. I turned around fully this time, along with half the class, because it was the last thing any of us expected. Grace was sitting exactly as she had been the entire lecture, calm, upright, her hand raised at a perfect, patient angle, the way a person raises their hand when they already know the answer and are simply waiting for permission to give it. Professor Kaur blinked, clearly caught off guard. In 3 months, Grace had never once volunteered to speak in his class. "Yes," he said slowly, gesturing toward her, "the human student. You have something to add?" Grace lowered her hand partway, resting it on the desk again, her fingers tapping once against the surface, thoughtful, unhurried. "I was just wondering," she said, and her voice was quiet, but it filled the room in a way that made every conversation stop completely. "If you'd like me to answer that question, about whether anyone here could survive a day on a real death world." The room went very still. Leora, beside me, had stopped writing entirely, her stylus hovering over her notes. Denna was fully awake now, sitting up straight. Even the students near the front, the ones who had been laughing and clapping only a minute earlier, had turned around in their seats to look. Professor Kaur let out a short laugh, though it did not quite reach his eyes. "It was a rhetorical question, Miss Whitmore, but I suppose I would not object to hearing your thoughts." "Go on." Grace tilted her head slightly, considering something, the way a person considers whether a topic is worth the time it will take to explain properly. "I don't think it's rhetorical," she said. "I think it's a real question, and I think the answer is more complicated than you're giving it credit for." A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was not how humans in our cohort were supposed to behave. Grace had spent an entire term being the quietest person in the room, and now, out of nowhere, she was contradicting a professor in front of 40 other students. Professor Kaur's 4 eyes narrowed slightly, though his tone stayed light, almost amused, the tone adults use when they think a child has said something a little too clever for its own good. "Is that so? And what makes you qualified to correct several centuries of accepted xenobiology, Miss Whitmore?" I do not think any of us, in that moment, understood how large a question that really was. I certainly did not. I was simply watching, along with everyone else, caught somewhere between curiosity and a strange prickling unease that I could not name. Grace did not answer right away. She looked at the professor for a long moment, calm and unbothered by the weight of 40 pairs of eyes on her. Then she glanced, briefly, toward the transparent dome above us, toward the slow, silent wheel of stars, as if she were looking past them, toward something much farther away, something none of the rest of us in that room had ever seen, and would not fully understand until it was far too late to simply return to our seats and pretend the question had never been asked. "I could tell you," she said finally, quiet and even, "but I don't think you'd believe me yet." Before Professor Kaur could respond, Before any of us could ask what she meant, a deep tone sounded through the hall, low and resonant, the kind of sound that every student at Corvenna Academy had been trained since their first week to recognize immediately and to fear. It was not a routine alert. It was not a scheduled drill. It was the sound of something on the station going very, very wrong. The alarm tone repeated twice, then gave way to a calm, mechanical voice that somehow made everything feel worse instead of better. Attention! Containment failure detected in Research Wing 4. All students and staff in adjacent sectors, please proceed to designated shelter points. This is not a drill. For a moment, nobody in the lecture hall moved. We simply stared at each other, 40 students frozen in place, as if stillness alone could make the announcement untrue. Then the room erupted. Chairs scraped backward. Bags were grabbed and dropped and grabbed again. Leora seized my arm so tightly I felt her claws through my sleeve, and Denna was already halfway up the aisle, moving with the rest of the crowd toward the main doors. Professor Kaur, to his credit, was shouting instructions, though his voice was mostly lost beneath the noise of 40 panicking students trying to funnel through 2 exits at once. Calmly, he kept saying, though there was nothing calm about the way his own hands were shaking as he waved us toward the doors. Calmly, please. Single file, this way. I do not remember deciding to run. I simply found myself moving, carried along by the crowd, Leora's claws still locked around my arm, the two of us pressed shoulder to shoulder with a dozen other students trying to squeeze through a doorway built for 2 people at a time. Somewhere behind me, someone shouted that the shelter point on this level was already full. Somewhere ahead, someone else shouted that the corridor to the secondary shelter was blocked. That was when I first understood that Research Wing 4 was not some distant, unrelated part of the station. It was directly beneath us. The floor shuddered, once, a deep vibration that traveled up through my legs and into my chest, like the entire station had taken a breath and held it. Emergency lighting flickered on along the corridor walls, casting everything in a dim red glow. Somewhere down the hall, a support strut groaned, a long, tired sound, like something enormous was straining against a weight it was never built to hold. "What is it?" Leora asked me, her voice pitched high and tight. "What's happening? What's in the research wing?" I did not know. Nobody around us seemed to know. Not fully, though scattered pieces of information were already moving through the crowd the way rumors always do during an emergency. Half true and half panic. Someone said there had been an experiment involving compressed atmosphere samples, something to do with a planet in the outer surveys, something that had been under study for weeks in a sealed lab 3 floors below the main academic wing. Someone else said a containment field had failed. Someone else said the failure had triggered a slow structural breach, a crack running through the deck plating itself, venting atmosphere into open space 1 section at a time. I did not know which version was true. I only knew that the corridor ahead of us had narrowed to a bottleneck, and that the crowd pressing forward had nowhere left to go. "This way," someone shouted, and the crowd shifted direction, funneling toward a side corridor that led, I realized with a sinking feeling, back toward the research wing itself, not away from it. Somewhere in the confusion, the group had simply followed the loudest voice instead of the safest path. I tried to pull back, tried to tug Leora with me, but the press of bodies around us was too strong. We were carried forward, deeper into the red emergency light, deeper toward the low, groaning vibration that seemed to be growing steadily louder. Then the lights failed completely. For 1 full second, there was nothing but darkness and the sound of 40 people calling out at once. Then the emergency lighting flickered back on, weaker now, tinted a deeper red, and I saw the corridor ahead of us clearly for the first time. The far wall had buckled. A support strut had given way, folding inward at an angle that should not have been physically possible, and behind it, through a gap no wider than my forearm, I could see straight through into Research Wing 4 itself. Vapor poured out of the gap in slow, curling clouds, catching the red light and glowing faintly, like something alive. A student near the front of the crowd, a Threnai boy I did not know by name, had fallen. He was pinned beneath a section of collapsed paneling that had come loose from the ceiling, one arm trapped, his face twisted with pain and confusion. Around him, students scrambled backward, desperate to put distance between themselves and the breach, and in doing so, simply left him there, alone, calling out for help that nobody seemed willing to give. I froze. I am not ashamed to admit that, though I have thought about that moment many times since. My body simply stopped. Every instinct I had, every lesson about self-preservation that my species had ever taught me, told me to move away from the danger, not toward it. Leora was frozen too, her claws digging into my arm hard enough to leave marks that lasted for days. Even Professor Core, who had followed the crowd out of the lecture hall and into the corridor behind us, stood at the edge of the panic, his 4 eyes wide, his mouth opening and closing without producing any words at all. The vapor kept pouring from the gap in the wall, thicker now, and beneath the groan of failing supports, I heard something else, a low hiss, rhythmic, almost mechanical, coming from somewhere inside the research wing itself, growing steadily closer to the breach. Nobody moved to help the trapped student. Nobody moved at all. And then I heard footsteps. Not running footsteps, not the frantic scrambling sound of the rest of us trying to escape. These were steady, even, deliberate, moving against the direction of the crowd instead of with it. I turned my head, along with Leora, along with a dozen other students who had gone completely still, and saw Grace walking calmly through the panicking crowd, straight toward the collapsed section of ceiling and the trapped Threnai boy pinned beneath it. She moved the way a person moves when they have already decided, somewhere deep inside themselves, exactly what they are going to do next, and are simply waiting for their body to catch up with the decision. There was no hesitation in her stride, no wide eyes, no trembling hands. She stepped past a Kathrani girl who had gone still with fright, past Professor Core, whose mouth was still opening and closing uselessly, and knelt down beside the trapped student without a single wasted movement. "Hey," she said to him, her voice calm, almost gentle, cutting cleanly through the noise of the corridor. "Look at me. Not at your arm, at me." The Threnai boy's eyes, wide with pain, found hers. "Good," Grace said. "I'm going to move this off you. It's going to hurt for about 2 seconds, and then it's going to feel a lot better. Okay?" He nodded, though I do not think he understood what she meant, and I certainly did not either, not yet. Grace shifted her grip on the fallen section of paneling, a slab of reinforced composite that had taken 3 maintenance workers and a lift assist to install during the original construction of the station, according to what I later learned. She braced her feet against the buckled deck plating, took one slow breath, and lifted. I do not have adequate words in my own language to describe what I saw next, and I have thought about how to explain it many times since that day. The panel came free, not slowly, not with visible strain, but in one smooth motion, as if it weighed nothing at all, as if the laws that governed every other body I had ever seen simply did not apply to hers in that moment. She set it aside, against the wall, out of the way of the crowd, and then reached down and helped the Threnai boy to his feet, supporting most of his weight against her own shoulder without so much as a change in her breathing. The corridor had gone almost silent, aside from the ongoing hiss from the breach and the low, distant groan of failing supports. 40 students and 1 professor stood frozen, staring at a girl none of us had ever really noticed before, who had just lifted, with what appeared to be minimal effort, a piece of debris that had trapped a full-grown Threnai boy beneath it. "We need to get him to medical," Grace said, glancing around the corridor, her voice steady, almost businesslike, as if she had not just done something that defied everything I understood about physical strength. "And we need to get everyone else away from that breach before it widens any further. Professor," she added, looking directly at Core, who still had not managed to say a single word, "is there a secondary shelter point on this level that isn't already at capacity?" It took the professor a long moment to find his voice. The East Corridor, Level 3 shelter. It should still have room." "Good," Grace said. "Let's move people that way, calmly, if we can manage it." She looked around at the rest of us, her pale eyes finding mine for just a moment, and something in that look made my chest tighten in a way I could not fully explain. It was not fear exactly. It was closer to the feeling of standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing, for the first time, just how far down the ground actually was. Behind her, the breach in the wall widened another few centimeters, and the hissing sound grew louder, and somewhere deep in Research Wing 4, something that had been contained a few minutes earlier was no longer contained at all. We moved as a group toward the east corridor, Grace still supporting most of the injured Threnai boy's weight. The rest of us clustered close behind her, as if her calm was the only solid thing left in a hallway that seemed to be falling apart around us. Leora had finally let go of my arm, though she stayed pressed against my side, her eyes fixed on the widening breach behind us every few seconds, as if checking that it had not caught up to us yet. The east corridor was narrower than the main hall, lined with pipe conduits running along the ceiling, most of them humming quietly under normal conditions and now flickering with warning lights that pulsed an urgent amber. We had gone perhaps 30 meters when a heavy bulkhead door ahead of us began to lower from the ceiling, sealing itself shut with a slow, grinding certainty. "No!" someone shouted from further up the group, a Kethrani student who had already passed beneath the threshold. "Wait, there's still people back here." The door did not wait. Emergency doors on Corvina Academy were built to seal automatically whenever a hull breach was detected nearby, a safety measure meant to protect the majority of the station by isolating damaged sections, regardless of who happened to be standing on the wrong side of the line when it triggered. I had read about the protocol during my first term. I had never imagined I would be standing directly beneath one of those doors as it came down. Grace did not slow her pace. She released the injured boy gently into the arms of two other students nearby, told them plainly to keep moving, and then closed the remaining distance to the bulkhead door in 3 long strides. The gap beneath the descending door was already down to perhaps a meter and shrinking fast. "Go," she said to the cluster of students still on our side, her voice carrying an authority that made people obey without questioning it. "Now, through the gap, quickly." One by one, students ducked beneath the lowering door, some crawling, some simply stooping low and hurrying through. Leora went. Denna went. I hesitated only long enough to glance back at Grace, who had planted herself directly beneath the descending edge of the door, both hands raised above her head, palms flat against the metal. "I'm not leaving until everyone's through," she said, not to me specifically, but to the corridor in general, her arms already trembling faintly with effort, though her voice did not waver at all. "Go. I've got it." I want to describe what I saw in that moment as clearly as I can, because I have told this part of the story many times since, and people always ask if I am exaggerating. I am not. The bulkhead door at Corvina Academy is built from layered composite plating, designed to withstand explosive decompression on one side and sudden hull breaches on the other. It is not designed to be held open by hand, and yet Grace stood beneath it, her boots braced against the deck plating, her shoulders squared beneath its weight, and the door simply did not close any further. I ducked beneath her arms and through the gap, and as I straightened up on the other side, I turned to look back one final time. Grace's face had changed only slightly. Her jaw was set. A faint sheen of sweat had appeared along her brow, but there was no fear in her expression, none of the wide-eyed panic that I imagined would be on my own face if I were the one holding a hull door open with my bare hands. The last student, a small Asandi boy from a lower year I did not recognize, scrambled through the gap, and only then did Grace step backward and let the door fall the rest of the way shut behind her, sealing with a heavy, final thud that echoed through the corridor. For a moment, nobody spoke. The group of us stood there, breathing hard, staring at her. "Are you?" Leora started, then seemed to lose the rest of the sentence entirely. "How did you just—" "We don't have time for that right now," Grace said, though not unkindly. She glanced past us, down the corridor toward the shelter point, and then back the way we had come, toward the sealed bulkhead door and whatever remained on the other side of it. Something in her expression shifted, a flicker of calculation, the look of a person weighing a decision that most of us would never have considered weighing at all. "There are still people back there," she said quietly, mostly to herself. "The breach team won't reach the deep sections in time if the corridor's sealed off completely." "What are you talking about?" Denna asked, her voice climbing toward panic again. "The door's shut. It's sealed. We're safe now. That's the whole point of the protocol." "The protocol protects most of the station," Grace said. "Not everyone in it. There's a secondary lab 3 levels down from the main breach, an isolated testing chamber. I saw it on the directory board back in the lecture hall corridor. If the automated systems triggered a full seal, anyone working down there just got locked in with whatever caused this in the first place." I did not understand, at the time, how she could possibly know that, or why it would matter to her at all. We were safe. The rest of us were already turning toward the shelter point, already imagining the relief of sitting down somewhere solid and waiting for the emergency teams to sort out the rest. But Grace was not looking toward the shelter point. She was looking at a narrow maintenance hatch set into the corridor wall, half hidden behind a support strut, the kind of access point most students walked past every day without ever noticing it existed. "You can't go back in there," Professor Kaur said, catching up to the front of the group at last, his robes torn at one shoulder, his breathing ragged. "Miss Whitmore, the safety protocols exist for a reason. Whatever caused this breach is still active. We do not even know what it is." "I know," Grace said simply. "That's exactly why I'm going." She was already moving toward the maintenance hatch before anyone could stop her, prying the access panel open with her fingers alone, the metal groaning under a grip that should not have been strong enough to bend it, and yet was. I do not know what made me follow her. Perhaps it was shame at having frozen so completely while she acted without hesitation. Perhaps it was simple curiosity, the same instinct that had made me spend 3 nights reading about Deathworld theory in the first place. Whatever the reason, I found myself stepping toward the hatch as well, ignoring Leora's hand grabbing at my sleeve, ignoring Professor Kaur calling my name behind me. "You should not be doing this either," Grace said, glancing back at me as she lowered herself into the narrow maintenance shaft beyond the hatch. There was no anger in her voice, only a kind of tired patience, as if she had expected someone to try and follow her and was mildly disappointed that it had actually happened. "Neither should you," I said, which was, admittedly, not a very strong argument. She studied me for a moment, then nodded once, short and decisive. "Stay behind me. Do exactly what I tell you. If I say run, you run, and you do not look back to see why." The maintenance shaft ran along the outer wall of the corridor, dimly lit by a single strip of emergency lighting, the air growing steadily colder and thinner the further down we climbed. My lungs began to ache after only a few minutes, my breathing turning shallow and quick, the way it does at high altitude, though we were well below the usual atmospheric processing levels of the station. I mentioned this to Grace, my voice tight with the effort of speaking at all. "It's thin down here," she said, glancing back at me with something close to concern. "The breach must be venting into the shaft system. You're doing okay. Just breathe slow, in through the nose if you can." I noticed, distantly, through the fog of my own discomfort, that her breathing had not changed at all, not even slightly. She moved through the thinning atmosphere exactly as she had moved through the crowded corridor above, steady, unhurried, completely unaffected by conditions that were making my chest ache with every breath. We reached the bottom of the shaft and emerged through another access hatch into a narrow service corridor that ran alongside the isolated testing chamber Grace had mentioned. The air here was thick with the same pale vapor we had seen pouring from the breach above, curling along the floor in slow, heavy waves, and the low hissing sound I had heard earlier was much louder now, almost rhythmic, like something breathing. Through a reinforced viewing panel set into the chamber wall, I could see 2 figures inside, a maintenance worker and what looked like a junior researcher, both pressed against the far wall of the chamber, both very clearly trapped. The chamber door itself had jammed at an angle during the initial breach, wedged half open, half closed, the frame around it visibly warped from heat or pressure or both. "There," Grace said, already moving toward the jammed door. "Stay back from the vapor if you can. It's not dangerous to breathe in small amounts, but it displaces oxygen fast in an enclosed space, and I don't know how much is still venting from inside." She reached the door and examined the gap for only a second before crouching low and wedging both hands into the space between the frame and the door itself. I opened my mouth to suggest we wait for the emergency teams, that this was clearly beyond what either of us should attempt alone, and then closed it again, because I already knew what she was about to do, and some part of me understood that trying to stop her would be a waste of the very little time we had. Grace planted her feet, exhaled slowly, and pulled. The door did not move easily. I could see the strain in her now. Finally, the muscles along her arms and shoulders standing out with visible effort, a low sound escaping her that was somewhere between a grunt and a growl. For 3 full seconds, nothing happened at all, and I found myself holding my breath, willing the door to give way, willing the impossible thing I had already watched her do twice today to happen one more time. Then, with a shriek of tearing metal, the warped door frame gave way, and the door swung open. The 2 trapped workers stumbled out immediately, coughing, gasping in the marginally clearer air of the service corridor. Grace caught the maintenance worker before he could fall, steadying him against her shoulder the same way she had steadied the Threnai boy earlier, and guided both of them back toward the maintenance shaft without a single wasted movement. "Up," she told them, gesturing toward the shaft. "Straight up. There's a hatch at the top leading back to the main corridor. Go now. Don't wait for us." They went, half climbing, half being pushed by Grace's steady hand at their backs, disappearing up into the shaft above. Grace turned back toward the chamber itself, and I saw her expression change again, that same flicker of calculation from before, weighing something the rest of us could not see. "The vapor's still venting," she said, mostly to herself. "There has to be a manual shutoff somewhere in there." "You are not going back inside," I said, and I surprised myself with how firm my own voice sounded, given how badly my legs were shaking. Grace looked at me for a long moment, and something in her expression softened slightly, though her decision did not change. "I have to. If this keeps venting, it's going to compromise the level above us eventually, and there are still people up there in the shelter point who think they're safe." She paused, glancing toward the shaft. "You should go up. I mean that. This part isn't something you need to be part of." "You said stay behind you and do what you're told," I said. "I am staying behind you." She almost smiled at that, a brief, tired flicker of something warmer beneath the calm, and then turned and stepped through the ruined doorway into the vapor-filled chamber beyond, and I followed her, my heart pounding, into the one place every instinct I had ever been taught was screaming at me to avoid. Inside the chamber, the vapor was thick enough that I could barely see more than a few steps ahead, pale and curling and strangely cold against my skin. Along the far wall, a bank of containment tanks stood open, their seals clearly ruptured, one of them still hissing steadily as gas escaped from a cracked valve near its base. Grace moved toward it without hesitation, crouching low to examine the valve mechanism, her fingers moving over the controls with a familiarity that struck me as strange, given that she had never, as far as I knew, set foot in this section of the academy before today. "It's a standard manual override," she said, half to herself, half to me, as she worked. "Whoever built this system used a fail-safe design, similar to something I trained on before I ever came here. Lucky, I suppose." She twisted a heavy locking ring at the base of the valve, straining against it for a moment before it finally gave way with a metallic clunk, and the hissing sound cut off entirely. The silence that followed felt enormous. "That's the venting stopped," Grace said, straightening up and wiping a hand across her brow, leaving a faint smear of grime behind. "It won't fix the structural damage upstairs, but it should stop things from getting worse down here." I stood there, in the thinning vapor, staring at her, and for the first time since the alarm had sounded, I let myself ask the question that had been building in me since the moment she lifted that panel off the trapped student's arm. "What are you?" I asked, and I did not mean it as an insult, though I heard, even as I said it, how it might have sounded that way. I meant it the way you might ask what a star is made of, or how deep the ocean goes. A question about something that did not fit the shape of what I understood the world to contain. Grace looked at me for a long moment, and something in her expression was tired now, in a way that had nothing to do with physical effort. "I'm human," she said simply. "That's all. Just human." "That is not an answer," I said. "I have met humans before. None of them could lift a bulkhead door with their hands." She let out a short breath that was almost a laugh, though there was no real humor in it. "Most humans probably couldn't either. Not like that, not without training. But where I grew up, we don't really get the option to be anything less than what you just saw." She glanced toward the ruined containment tanks, then back at me. "Come on, let's get back upstairs before your professor decides to send a search team down here after both of us." We climbed back up through the maintenance shaft in silence, and by the time we emerged into the main corridor, the emergency lighting had shifted from red to amber, a sign, Professor Core later explained, that the immediate danger had passed and structural teams were already moving in to assess the damage. A crowd had gathered near the sealed bulkhead door, students and staff alike, murmuring anxiously among themselves, and the moment Grace and I climbed out of the access hatch, every conversation in the corridor stopped at once. Professor Core pushed through the crowd toward us, his robe still torn, his 4 eyes wide with something that looked, to my surprise, closer to fear than relief. "You went back in," he said, staring at Grace. "After the door sealed. You went back into an active containment breach." "There were people trapped in the lower testing chamber," Grace said. Matter of fact, as if this explained everything that needed explaining. "They're fine. So is the venting valve, for what it's worth." A ripple of disbelief moved through the gathered crowd. Someone near the back asked how that was even possible, how anyone could survive prolonged exposure to a decompressing chamber, let alone force open a warped door and manually seal a ruptured valve with bare hands. Professor Core seemed to be asking himself the exact same question, and for the first time since I had known him, he did not appear to have a ready answer. "Miss Whitmore," he said slowly, "I would like you to come with me to the administrative office. Now, if you don't mind, there are some questions I believe need answering, and given the circumstances, I think it would be best if we had this conversation properly, rather than in a corridor full of frightened students." Grace glanced at me, then at the crowd, then nodded once. "Fine, but I'd like him to come too," she said, tilting her head toward me. "He followed me down there. He should hear whatever gets said. I do not know why she asked for that. I have wondered about it many times since. Perhaps she simply wanted a witness. Perhaps she understood, better than any of us at that point, that the truth she was about to tell would be easier to carry if at least one other person in the room had already seen a small piece of it firsthand. The administrative office was a quiet, circular room near the top of the Academy's central spire, its walls lined with data terminals, and a single wide viewport looking out over the slow curve of the station below. Professor Core sat behind a broad desk, his hands folded in front of him, while Grace sat across from him, unhurried, and I stood near the door, feeling distinctly out of place. "I want to be clear," Professor Core said, "that I am not accusing you of anything. What you did today likely saved several lives, and the Academy will recognize that appropriately. But I have taught Deathworld theory for 11 years, Miss Whitmore, and I have always taught it as exactly that, a theory, an old myth without evidence. What I saw today does not fit comfortably inside that teaching." "No," Grace agreed quietly, "it probably doesn't. Your species records," the professor continued, tapping at a data terminal beside him, pulling up a thin file that seemed almost embarrassingly sparse compared to the detailed records kept on most other species in the Academy's database, are surprisingly limited. Earth is listed as a member world of the wider community, admitted through standard diplomatic channels roughly 2 decades ago. Population figures, general biology, standard atmospheric composition, but very little beyond that. No detailed survey of native predator populations, no formal classification of environmental hazard levels. It reads, frankly, like a file that was written by people who did not fully understand what they were filing. Grace was quiet for a moment, looking out at the slow curve of the station through the viewport, her expression distant, as if she were looking at something much farther away than the metal and glass in front of her. "That's probably accurate," she said finally. "Most of the delegations who came to Earth during first contact only saw what we let them see: cities, universities, diplomatic buildings, controlled environments." She turned back to face the professor directly. "They didn't see the parts of the planet that actually shaped what we are. Nobody brings visiting delegations through a monsoon season, or introduces them to what happens when you're a few hundred kilometers from the nearest hospital and something goes wrong at night." "Then tell me," Professor Kaur said, leaning forward slightly, "what would they have seen if they had looked?" Grace considered the question for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was calm, almost gentle, the way a person speaks when they are choosing to be patient with a question they have answered many times before, in many different ways, to many different audiences who were not quite ready to hear it. "Earth's gravity is higher than most core worlds in this sector," she said. "Not extreme, but enough that most visiting species notice it within the first hour and feel it in their joints by the end of the first day. Our atmosphere carries more oxygen than almost anywhere else surveyed, which sounds pleasant until you understand what that also means for how fast fire spreads, and how much energy our bodies are built to sustain over long periods without rest. We have entire regions of the planet that remain, even now, largely unclaimed by permanent settlement, not because we lack the technology to build there, but because the environment itself has never stopped being genuinely dangerous. Predators that hunt in coordinated groups. Diseases that mutate faster than most of our neighboring species would consider survivable. Weather systems capable of leveling structures across hundreds of kilometers with almost no warning." She paused, glancing briefly at me, and I found I could not look away. "None of that makes us special," she continued. "It just makes us adapted. Every trait you saw today, the strength, the endurance, the way I could function in that thin, cold air down there, it isn't extraordinary to me. It's just Tuesday. It's the baseline my body was built around, the same way your body is built around whatever baseline your homeworld required of it." Professor Kaur sat back slowly in his chair, and for a long moment, he said nothing at all. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the confident, dismissive edge it carried during the lecture only hours earlier. "Then the old survey logs," he said quietly, "the abandoned outposts, the reports of a species matching Deathworld markers, extreme strength, extreme durability, aggressive problem-solving under pressure. Probably us," Grace said simply, "or people like us, anyway. Humans have been quietly present in this part of the galaxy longer than most of your official records suggest. We just don't advertise it very loudly. It tends to make people nervous." She glanced at me again, and this time there was the faintest trace of something almost like humor in her expression. "No offense." "None taken," I said, though my voice came out smaller than I intended. Professor Kaur rubbed a hand slowly across his face, 4 eyes closing briefly, and when he opened them again, he looked, for the first time since I had known him, genuinely uncertain of himself. 11 years, he said quietly. 11 years, I have stood in front of students and told them Deathworlds do not exist. That the very idea was folklore built from fear and bad data. He looked up at Grace. "I owe you, and every student in that lecture hall, a rather significant correction. You're not the only one who's ever gotten it wrong," Grace said, not unkindly. "Most of the galaxy still thinks the same thing. It's easier to believe something that frightening simply isn't real." Outside the viewport, the station continued its slow, silent turn beneath the stars, unaware and unbothered, exactly as it had been that morning before any of us understood how much the world had just changed. 3 weeks passed before the Academy fully finished assessing the damage from the breach, and in that time, word of what had happened in Research Wing 4 spread through Corvina Academy the way important news always does, first as rumor, then as gossip, then finally as something closer to accepted fact. By the end of the first week, Everyone in our year knew that the quiet human girl who sat alone at the back of the lecture hall had lifted a support panel off a trapped student, held a sealed bulkhead door open by hand, and forced her way into a decompressing chamber to save 2 more lives, all without a single visible moment of hesitation. What surprised me most, in the days that followed, was how little any of it seemed to change Grace herself. She still arrived to class early. She still took small, careful notes. She still ate lunch quietly, though now, more often than not, Leora and Denna and I found ourselves sitting with her, and Oscar the Threnai student joined us as well, and somewhere in the space of those first few days, the quiet corner table by the window stopped being a place where one person sat alone and became simply the place where our group sat together. The first real curriculum change came sooner than any of us expected. Professor Kaur announced, at the start of the second week, that the department was suspending the standard unit on Deathworld theory pending a full review, and that in its place, students would be studying a revised syllabus built around what he called verified environmental extremity classifications, a title so carefully neutral that Leora laughed out loud the first time she read it off the updated course board. "They can't even say the word Deathworld anymore," she said, shaking her head as we walked to class together. 11 years of telling everyone it wasn't real, and now they're terrified of saying it out loud in case it sounds like they're admitting they were wrong. "They are admitting they were wrong," Denna pointed out. "That's rather the point." I found myself watching Grace during these conversations more than I probably should have, curious whether any of it bothered her, whether she resented having spent an entire term as an overlooked footnote in a class that mocked her own homeworld as a fairy tale. If it did bother her, she never said so. She seemed, if anything, faintly amused by the careful new wording of the course material, the way a person might be amused watching someone else tiptoe nervously around a subject that had never frightened them to begin with. "It's not really their fault," she told me once, as we walked back from the revised lecture together, the two of us falling into step in a way that had become comfortable without my quite noticing when it started. "Nobody wants to believe the universe can be that harsh and still produce something worth talking to. It's easier to imagine a monster than a neighbor." "You do not think of yourself as harsh," I said. It was not quite a question. She considered that for a moment, her pale eyes tracking the slow curve of the corridor ahead of us. "I think Earth is harsh," she said finally. "I think it always has been, long before we ever built a single city or launched a single ship. But I don't think that's the same thing as being harsh myself. It just means I grew up learning that the world doesn't owe you gentleness, and that the only reasonable response to that is to be gentle with the people around you anyway, since apparently nobody else out there is going to bother." I did not have a good response to that, so I said nothing at all, and we walked the rest of the way to the dormitory levels in a silence that did not feel uncomfortable in the least. The true test of how much things had changed came nearly a month after the breach, during a scheduled survival exercise that every second-year student at Corvenna Academy was required to complete, a simulated planetary drop meant to test basic emergency response skills in a controlled but genuinely challenging environment. Our cohort was assigned to a simulation chamber calibrated to mimic a mid-range temperate world, cold nights, uneven terrain, limited visibility, and a series of staged equipment failures designed to force teams to improvise. I was paired with Grace, along with Leora and a Kithrani student named Torvin, and for the first hour of the exercise, everything proceeded exactly as our instructors intended. We built a shelter. We located a simulated water source. We navigated around a marked hazard zone meant to represent unstable ground. Then, roughly 90 minutes into the exercise, the simulation chamber's environmental controls suffered what the instructors later described as a genuine, unplanned malfunction, an actual equipment failure layered accidentally on top of the staged one, dropping the ambient temperature in our section far below its intended simulation range and triggering an unscheduled full lighting failure across the chamber. For a moment, standing in sudden freezing darkness, I felt the same cold thread of panic I remembered from the corridor outside Research Wing 4, and beside me, I heard Leora's breath catch sharply, and Torvin's claws scrape nervously against the frozen ground. "Everyone stay where you are," Grace said calmly, her voice cutting through the darkness exactly the way it had cut through the panic in that corridor weeks earlier, though this time there was no trace of urgency in it at all, only steady, patient reassurance. "This isn't dangerous. It's just uncomfortable. The chamber has backup lighting on a short delay. Just give it a moment." True to her word, dim emergency lighting flickered on within a minute, casting the frozen simulation terrain in pale blue light, and I found, to my own surprise, that my racing heartbeat had already begun to slow, simply because her voice had told me it would be fine, and some part of me, without quite deciding to, had chosen to believe her. "How did you know it wasn't dangerous?" Torvin asked afterward, once the instructors had confirmed the malfunction and adjusted the simulation parameters. "It felt dangerous. It felt exactly like an emergency." Grace considered the question honestly, rather than brushing it aside. "Cold like that isn't instantly dangerous," she said. "It takes time to become a real problem, and we had shelter, and we had each other, and none of us were hurt. Real emergencies are usually a little quieter than they feel in the moment. The loud, frightening part is mostly your own body trying to get your attention." She glanced at me. "You did fine, by the way. You didn't panic. You checked on Leora before you checked on yourself." I had not realized she had noticed that, and something about hearing it said aloud settled a small, quiet weight in my chest that I had been carrying, unnoticed, since the day of the breach. I had spent weeks quietly comparing myself to her, measuring my own frozen hesitation in that corridor against her calm, immediate action, and finding myself lacking every single time. Hearing her say, simply and without exaggeration, that I had done fine, mattered more to me than I expected it to. "I still froze," I said. "When the panel fell on that student, I did not move at all." "Most people freeze," Grace said. "That's not a flaw in you. It's just what most bodies are built to do when the danger is bigger than anything they've ever practiced for. I only moved because I've had practice with bigger dangers than most people here ever will, not because I'm made of something better than you are." She paused, glancing out at the slowly warming simulation terrain around us, the frost already beginning to melt under the chamber's recovering systems. "The difference isn't courage, it's just familiarity, and familiarity is something you can build, if you want to." I thought about that a great deal in the weeks that followed. I thought about it during the revised lectures, where Professor Kaur, humbled and considerably more careful with his words, walked us through updated data on environmental extremity classifications, data that now, quietly and without much fanfare, included a small but growing section on Earth itself. I thought about it the day the Academy formally recognized Grace's actions during the breach, a modest ceremony that she seemed to find more embarrassing than gratifying, standing at the front of an assembly hall while an administrator read a commendation aloud, her expression carefully neutral the entire time. I think about it still, now, longer after these events than I once expected to be telling this story at all. I think about the lecture hall on that first day, the professor's confident dismissal of a species he had never truly understood, and the quiet girl in the back row who had spent an entire term being underestimated by every single one of us, myself included, simply because she did not feel any particular need to prove herself to a room full of people who were not yet ready to listen. Deathworlds are real, I know that now, the way you know something not because you read it in a data file, but because you watched it lift a door with its bare hands and walk calmly into the one place every instinct told the rest of us to run from. But I have come to believe something else as well, something Grace herself would probably insist on adding, if she were the one telling this story instead of me. Being forged by a harsh world does not make a person harsh in return. It only means that when the day finally comes that gentleness is needed, urgently, immediately, in a corridor full of people too frightened to move, there will be at least one person in the room who already knows exactly what to do, and who raises a hand, calm and certain, before anyone else has even finished asking the question. That is what I remember most, in the end, not the broken panel, or the sealed door, or the vapor filling that ruined chamber, just a quiet hand, lifted patiently above a sea of frightened faces, waiting only for permission to help.